was in one clerk's hand, a small hesitation at the loop of an L that matched a loop I had seen in a page of the ledger no more than a seam. And yet it made a path through the city. I am a bookseller. My days are spent in the intimacy of paper. I measure paper by weight, by sound when fanned, by the scent that rises when one opens a fresh ream. Paper tells me the route it has taken, the hands that have used it, even the poverty it has seen. So when I saw the loop, I felt a muscle in my chest tighten. I do not pretend to the cleverness of some conspirator. I simply know how hands behave and how certain clerks, when they write a name at the end of the night, tuck their pen in the same place as they tuck complaints under their tongue. I did not go to Renaud at once. One must not, in such seasons, offer one's discoveries as if they were gifts. A man like him receives facts as scalpel, and sure they become instruments he uses to shape the city. Instead, I watched the pattern of his gaze as if it were a weather map. Renaud did not shout. He did not posture. He arranged information and then, like a priest, he read it aloud to himself. Letters fascinated him the way other men are fascinated by guns or maps. In his office the candles burned pale and steady, and he would lean over the desks as if to listen to the paper's breath. A week of small things convinced me further. A clerk misfiled a registry in the municipal office. A parish priest received a summons too late. A woman who had been named in a letter found herself questioned. Each of these episodes, taken alone, could be the effect of careless civil servants in a city stripped thin by hunger. Taken together and set against Renaud's methodical attention to detail, they suggested a pattern. It is the way of minds bred in an administration that certainty must be enforced. Make a list, he seemed to say. Read it. Believe it, and the people will obey. I watch him one morning as he takes up a stool at the tribunal window, his profile like a cliff. He is a man made of ledger edges. The street smells of rain and horse, and a hawker calls a trade in pamphlets with the shrillness of someone trying to be heard above the market's raw new voices. Renaud makes his notes in small, ragged handwriting, his quill moving as if it is mapping the breadth of the city. A policeman crosses his palm with a folded scrap, and the commissaire's pupils narrow with the pleasure of a puzzle partially solved. He reads the scrap and then, with the precision of a surgeon, he tears the corner and tucks it into a folio. He keeps things. He files them like bones in a cabinet. You, who will see this book's lines perhaps years from now, must not imagine him as some kind of zealot divorced from tenderness. He has tenderness folded into the arithmetic of his duty. Once, when a mother collapsed at his desk with the corpse of a child in her arms, he did not speak the language of tribunals. He wrapped his coat about her shoulders and made arrangements that were gentle in the only way a man of power can be gentle, by ensuring that the records would not be used again the way they had been once. His zeal is born of a conviction that order prevents chaos. That is what I mean when I say he treats lists as scripture. He believes, with a fervor close to faith, that names need fixing in writing in order for the city to hold together. Perhaps that is why, when I first realized he had begun to watch the printing presses, my stomach tightened in a way I knew by now. The presses are teeth. They will grind what we give them, and the sound of the press is a drum that calls men into the street. Printers make rumor into paper and paper into a public fact. Tyne knows this better than anyone I care for. His hands are indented with the scars of metal and type. He works in a shop whose windows face a narrow court, and he keeps his plates hidden in a chimney himself and in the false bottom of a trunk. To see Renaud come for him would have been, for all the metaphors one could muster, like seeing a wolf circle a nest. The first time I saw Renaud come close to Tyne's world, it was not with a sabre nor with men in uniform banging doors. It was quieter. He asked for particulars, the names of journeymen who had worked at a certain press, the dates when a plate had been ordered, the peculiarities of ink. Such questions read like the inventory of a jeweler, and yet they had the potential to alter lives. Printers who had once worked unremarkably were now characters on a ledger. I do not believe he suspected Tyne as a conspirator in the beginning. He suspected, perhaps, that some printer was making lists that had been used as instruments. Yet suspicion breeds focus, and focus breeds pressure. Renaud's method was to force legibility by cataloguing everything. He walked the corridors of the municipal office with a sallow patience, questioning clerks in a manner that implied no immediate violence but promised a different kind, the bureaucratic violence of erasure. A clerk who misfiled could cause a woman to be unnamed, a husband to be listed as absent. In time, he could remake whole calendars of identity by persuading the record keepers that a certain list was authoritative. The ledger's power in his hands was the power to select which names would be legible and which would be footnotes. There was a particular morning when I saw him approach the Printers' Guild with the smooth, buttered manners of a man who had learned how to make enemies volunteer their information. He spoke in tones that asked for help for the Republic. He asked about plates and about orders. The tradesmen who served his tea were delighted to oblige a commissaire. They thought themselves useful to a good machine. I saw Tyne slip into the crowd with his hands empty and his face like a man who makes his livelihood on the edge of danger. He made a small jest to the guild master about the poor quality of paper this autumn, and then he moved on. I watched him because I could not help myself. To watch the man who presses your ledger is a human failing, perhaps the same failing that makes mothers watch their children cross streets. That evening, a thin folded paper was left at the shop's door. No footmarks, no signature, just a scrap folded like an accusation. I unfolded it and read a list of ordinary things, names of printers, dates, a note that a clerk at the municipal office had been over-attentive to a particular folio. It was not addressed to me. It could have been meant to frighten or to inform. I put it in my pocket and went upstairs to the back room, where the daylight came through a small sliver of roof and made the dust visible, like small constellations. When you keep books long enough, you learn the economy of small comforts, the way a beam of light will make a page hospitable. That night I copied the scrap into a ledger of my own, as if duplicating the act of creating the list might itself foil the list maker. There is a peculiar thrill to copying at night. The city thins and the press of neighbors' breath recedes, leaving the paper to speak. I fingered the quill and let the names fall, and in the balance between my hand and the ink I measured the distance between observation and action. When one copies, one makes a thing new, and in making one empowers it. I am not trying to be paradoxical to sound wise. This is the arithmetic of our time. Every time one of us copies a name, every time one of us writes a date with a deliberate hand, we make it more possible that the name will be read aloud in a square. Copying is not innocence. Jean Morel, whom I had come to know as a man whose face is like bread and whose conscience is the kind that wrinkles rather than shouts, saved me in a way that was both small and yet resoundingly moral. He had a job in the municipal office. He moved ledgers for a living and in doing so carried the city in his pocket. He made mistakes sometimes, and those mistakes were acts of mercy. When Renaud's inquiries began to look like a sieve drawn across registers, Jean's hand trembled. He misfiled a return and then, because he had a tenderness the commissaire did not see, he wrote an apology and let the matter look like clerical error. I would like to say that Jean did this because of some heroic principle, but the truth is more delicate. He did it because he could not stand to see faces torn by the certainty of a name when he had the power small as it was to blur it. He came by the shop one dusk, his coat smelling faintly of the rain that had begun to fall, and he touched my sleeve as if to hand me something along with a message. He said, in a voice that was meant to be merely gossipy and became urgent, that Renaud had been reading parish returns at an unusual hour. He has a way with writing, he said, as if he is reading someone else's prayers. His hand felt cold on my wrist and he laughed without heat. "Be careful," he said. There was a sorrow in him like the flavor of burnt sugar. I asked him what he wanted me to do. He shrugged. "Not much. Be careful where you put your ledgers. Watch the apprentices you take on." He meant, in the silence that followed, what he could not say, that the city was being made to answer to a list, and that lists could be altered. Jean Morel is not a man of violence. He is, perhaps, the kind of man who will slip a book out of an archive and smear his hands with ink so as to make the world less legible. I prefer him because he is so human. When the world demands ledger-like answers, human hesitations are the small fissures that let light in. Madeleine, for all her dress and her salon's coquetries, brought a different kind of warning. She has a gift for making rumor into an instrument, and then playing it like a lute. She came to the shop with a shawl and a tight smile, and when she spoke she used the economy of perfumed language. "They are asking questions of our printers," she said as if tasting a new spice. "They like the idea of the Republic," she added, "but they dislike the idea of being undone by paper." Her hands kept time upon the wood of the counter, measuring something I could not yet name. We are all, as it happens, easier to name than to hide. Printers will print and clerks will clerk. People will speak at salons and laundries, and then be surprised when the commissaire reads their words back to them in the morning. Renaud's eyes do not simply search. They translate the habits of speech into official record. He has a way of looking at a room, of seeing where a particular kind of rumor would sit, and then of asking precisely the questions that will move that rumor into the field of law. The danger, therefore, is not simply that he will find Tien. The danger is that he will begin to understand the grammar we use to move names across the city. That night, as rain came down in a slow and polite fashion, I slept poorly. My sleep is measured in ledgers. I wake to ink stains on the sleeve of my thought. I imagined Renaud hunched over a table, comparing hands like a man comparing the faces of those he will be asked to judge. I imagined the municipal office as a hive in which he had found a new way of turning rumor into fat. If he could prove that a certain clerk had been habitually supplying names to some anonymous ledger, he could, with the assurance of a man who draws up lists, purge the city of doubt by making the doubt itself an offense. The shop the next morning felt smaller. I moved about with the same care as always, dusting spines and running my fingers through my catalogue. But the city had a new measure, surveillance had a name and a method. Customers came and went. Some bought prayer books, others bought pamphlets with thin joy. I served them all with my usual irony, with a voice that held as much than it revealed. People have a way of leaning on familiar surfaces. They do not always notice the tremor of the hand that offers them a book at midday. Tien ducked into the shop with the look of a man who had stayed up too late and yet had something to say that could not wait for the evening. He had news. "They have been asking about plates," he said. He set down a sheet of proofing paper as if it were a confession. "They did not search," he added, "but they have ways to make you speak without speaking." He wanted to know what we should do. I told him the truth that always sounds like a parable. Do nothing that will make your hand one they can read. Hide where you can. Misfile where you must. He laughed, that unsteady laugh of a man who knows how to press type and yet is not certain he will press the right side of history. "If they come," he said, "we will be ready." His certainty is always an attempt to make his own fear into an armor. I left the shop that afternoon and walked the city as a woman who is measured by the things she can see and the things she cannot. I watched Renaud's men at the tribunal window. They seemed to be everywhere at once, their shadows moving across the cobbles like a measurement. The hawkers called, the laundresses passed, and a boy sold chestnuts in a cone of brown paper. The city breathes and is indifferent to the anxieties of one bookseller, but the mechanisms of record-keeping do not care about my particular fear. They care only for order. As dusk folded itself into the alleys, I realized that the question before me was not merely how to hide the ledger, but how to make ourselves less legible to a commissaire whose business it is to see. How does one make a thing invisible to a man for whom everything is a record? The answer is not simple. It is made of small mistakes, quiet hesitations, human follies placed like stones in the river of administration. It is made of Jean Morel's misfiled returns, of Tiny's burned plates, and of the delicate language of Madeline's salons. It is, in short, the work of human hands that refused to be reduced to columns and boxes. At the end of the day, I put the little folded scrap into the false bottom, where I kept other small papers I was not proud to own. I thought about the commissaire and the way he measured the world. I thought about his tenderness and his zeal, and about how a man who keeps lists can come to believe that by naming he saves. The shop was quiet. Outside, the city moved, and the guillotine's shadow crossed another square as if merely for a moment of geometry. I closed the shutters and sat with my hands stained with ink, and with the heavy, slow understanding that a man with a ledger and a conscience is likely to come for those who use paper as resistance. It will not be as in the tales where cavalry storm and trumpets sound. It will be slow, a folding in upon us, the way a map compresses territory, so that only the most careful routes remain. Renaud watches. That is the beginning and the middle of this new season. One watches a man like him and measures not only his threat, but his vulnerabilities. Men who keep ledgers believe in the legibility of their instruments. They prefer that others arrange themselves accordingly. To the extent that we can be illegible, to the extent that we can make our lives look like the ordinary detritus of an exhausted city, we will have a chance. Whether that chance will be sufficient to save the friends I love, or whether it will simply buy a few moments before the noose is knotted, I cannot say. But I know the shape of his attention now, and in knowing him I have the first means to move. Late, as I went to bed with my ledger under my arm, a thought came like a stitch. If Renaud reads ledgers as scripture, perhaps scripture can be read against him. Names can be counted not only by falsity but by multiplicity. If people begin to write their own lists clumsy, urgent marginalia that testify to human complexity, then his neat columns will be less authoritative. It is a dangerous and perhaps sentimental hope, but it is all I have. I lay down with the sound of rain like a hand's breath against the roof, and thought of the cartridges of type in Tian's press, of Jean Morel's misfiled lines, and of Madeline's gossip like a blade disguised as lace. Outside the shop the city moved on. Inside, the pages waited. Renaud watched. I have learned to measure hours by paper. Dawn for me smells of glue and a certain dampness that comes of bound folios breathing after a night's rain. Noon tastes of newspaper ink in the marketplace, a metallic tang on the tongue, where the guillotine's presence sits like a cold coin in the mouth of the city. Night is the time for scheming. Night is the press native hour. It is strange and perhaps no more than profession's vanity. To say that the city was quieter when nothing scandalous happened, quiet as a folded sheet yet in the year when the cobbles ran a little red at certain corners, even silence had its own noise. The distant clatter of a cart that carried wood for the scaffold, the whispered lists spoken under shawls in the laundries. The way shop shutters closed a fraction more quickly when a magistrate rode past. I kept my shutters half closed by choice, as though keeping myself behind a false bottom in the world at large. We had come to the idea of a larger deception slowly, like a paragraph built from margins and marginalia. Our first falsifications had been discreet, a name reversed here, a date misprinted there, a list that sent a single messenger the wrong way down a lane. Each small diversion had been a proof of a theory, that the ledger depended more on belief than on inevitability. When the city read a name aloud and no one moved, the name had the power to produce movement. If you could alter what was read, you could perhaps alter who moved. That was the thought we rehearsed between the stacks, half sarcastic, half hopeful, until hope, in its stubbornness, became a plan. Tiana's press was the only place the plan could be outworked. The press is, as Tien likes to say, a machine of patience, a stubborn, noisy beast that takes what you give it and, in the slow and mechanical way of things that endure, makes it public. He resisted the idea at first. I could understand his misgivings. Forgery is one thing when it saves a grocer from a mistaken indictment. It becomes another when you attempt to reroute a procession of state ceremony. Forgery implies deceit. Deceit implies not only the loss of trust, but, in our time, a bodily cost, yet he understood type better than any man I knew. He spoke to the letters the way a priest might speak to relics, with a kind of reverence tinged by fear. We met at dusk in his shop, where the press iron belly lay quiet and the smell of oil pooled at the corners. Tien's cheeks were drawn with fatigue, his hands black as the margins of a crime novel. He held out a sheet, not the counterfeit, but a clean sample of paper, and I could see the way his fingers sought the texture the way I have always stroked a new binding. "We will need to match the clerk's hand," he said. "Not only the paper, not only the date. The ledger is not merely its ink. It is the manner in which the ledger is presented to people." He explained the work in terms I liked, terms that made craftsmanship into a kind of moral arithmetic. "We must produce the plausible impossible," he said. "Something that will not sound false when read aloud by a man whose life depends on not hearing any paradox." To hide the counterfeits making, we produced a sample run the way legitimate presses do, proofs burned in the stove, plates scarred clean. Eyewitness accounts of plates being lost in the river. Yet the truth of falsehood is that it is always a copy of a copy. We studied the original ledger's marginalia, the small ticks and unnatural slants that a wary clerk made in the corner of the page. The ledger's hand was purposeful and dull, the same quill stroke repeated so many times it became a kind of signature. I took a rubbing of the quill's pressure on a scrap. Tien mixed ink until the stain matched the ledger's age. He ground galls with the kind of patience that borders on piety. While Tien made type, I made narrative. A list is not merely names. It is a story that a city will read as though it were an incision. We could put into the list a few names that were already scheduled, a stitch of truth, and then graft in a handful of names that had not been called. We placed the counterfeit as close as possible to authenticity, the same register, the same departmental headers, a plausible mistake in the clerk's haste. The ledger read like a law and like a scripture at once, so we wrote as if we meant to command God. Lucy, whose hands have become quicker since she began to understand that ink can be a weapon, sat with me selecting where to edge the false list into the sequence. She liked names the way children like bright beads. She would whisper a name and tilt her head as if testing its weight. "We ought to put in a smuggler, someone with friends who will cause confusion when they are not presented," she said. "And perhaps a poor tailor, they are such good hiders, and people will rally with a tailor's pity." Her imagination was fertile and sometimes dangerous. She wanted drama. She wanted a public moment where the crowd would rise like yeast and prove itself capable of acting. "The ledger's power is in the reading," she told me. "If the name is read and then contradicted, the contradiction becomes a kind of new name. People will begin to think they can treat names like garments and try them on." By night we had a small army in the press, Tien and his apprentice, 2 journeymen who owed us favors. Bastien, who had the nerve and speed of a boy whose bread had often been taken from him, and Lucy, who folded lists with swift fingers. Bastien's job was to dart through streets and barter the counterfeit into the hands of those who would not question its authority, the hawkers who shouted the day's edicts, the wardens who took lists to magistrates, the petty clerks who moved papers from one register to another. To Bastien we gave the smallest role and the most dangerous, to place a single sheet under a clerk's bundle during the procession. If the clerk read it, then the law of the moment would be made to misstep. If he did not, then we had produced only a pamphlet and a dream. On the appointed morning the city was a body of expectation. Executions gather people the same way fairs do. There is hunger in both. The guillotine's presence makes the square a theatre, with a particular kind of audience, some there out of duty, some curiosity, some a grim religious fervour. We chose a procession with 3 scheduled names, 2 men known across a neighbourhood, a woman whose story had been whispered for weeks. The counterfeit would not seek to erase their fate entirely, too bold a variant risks too great a backlash, but to create a fissure. We printed our list with 2 of the scheduled names, the woman included, so the pattern would not look implausible, and then interposed an extra sequence that misnumbered the order, and in the shift, added a small paragraph which instructed the clerks to present certain prisoners first in a nearby wardhouse due to clerical confusion. I went to the square early, my hands in pockets to disguise the way they trembled. There are conversations you can have only with a crowd, and I had learned to watch how a crowd carries information, as rumor, as opinion, as something that travels by touch and by the small reiterations that people make to themselves. Madeleine stood near a fountain, her smile like a curtain pulled across the day's cruelty. She moved through the crowd with a languid competence, a conversation at a time, planting a notion here and a misdirection there. She was our social device, the trained hand that could, with a bemused aside, alter the course of a rumor. When the clerk stepped forward and began to read, there was the usual hush. The way a public silence hollows itself when a man pronounces a name that will determine a future. I had placed Lucy among the hawkers, fingers working a seam in her cuff where a list waited folded. Bastien hovered near the magistrate's assistant, the kind of boy whose smallness is his protection and his peril. At the moment when the clerk's eyes slid down the list and hesitated, Bastien brushed a sleeve, and the counterfeit slipped beneath the official stack. The pause was almost comical in its ordinariness, an assistant muttering about a misfiled set of papers, a man in a tribunal cap fanning himself with a bent ledger. The world has taught me that monumental things often happen because of petty inconveniences. The clerk read on. Somewhere near the scaffold a horse shifted its weight. A name that should have come 3rd came 5th. A sentence about a clerical misprint was read aloud with an officiousness that, once pronounced, acquires the authority of practice. People shifted, and a man with a beard I had traded a book to once earlier in the week saw an opening and bolted. He was not one of our carefully chosen names. He was someone whose smile had previously sold me a pamphlet. I had not intended to free him. His escape was a small, irrational miracle, a slip of leather, a turned head, a guard distracted by a boy who had shouted a name has been misread, and pointed at a page. In that second a wiry figure melted into a market alley, and the city swallowed him like a secret. There was a sound like a low wind passing through teeth murmur first, then a nervous laugh, then a shout. For an instant the square was not a place of inevitable endings but a field of surprise. People found a new muscle in their faces, incredulity. If the ledger could be wrong, then perhaps names could be argued with. Young men began to call out to each other. Women clutched children to their breasts and whispered to neighbors that perhaps someone could be spared. The moment expanded as rumor does, less precise than fact, more contagious than truth. Our triumph tasted like iron and honey. It was not clean. We had succeeded beyond calculable expectation. 2 prisoners were moved, shifted by the clerk's mistaken order, and one of them eluded the guard. The other was saved because a caravan of provincial merchants took advantage of the confusion to press past the cordons and ferry the released into a cart bound for a market town where papers change hands as commonly as bread. There is no pure victory in such times. Victory always comes laced with fear, since to win a single skirmish is to prove to those with power that the war is winnable. That afternoon the city hummed with a different pitch. The ledger's certainty had been breached. A laugh half dangerous threaded through parlor rooms and taverns. Madeleine sat at a window when I returned to the shop, her hands folding a handkerchief as though she were nervous at the way cloth folds. "You should have seen their faces," she said. Her voice was a slight